On June 15, 2005, 18-year-old Samantha Miller went missing in the heart of Red Rock Canyon, Nevada. Her tent was untouched, and only her phone was found in the dry grass 1 mile away. For 10 years, her parents waited for at least one clue until a former detective met a woman in a small Canadian town who looked just like Samantha. But was it really her, and where was she all this time? You will find out in this video. Enjoy the movie. Some names and details in this story have been changed for anonymity and confidentiality. Not all photographs are from the actual scene. On June 15, 2005, the Red Rock Canyon National Preserve in Nevada greeted visitors with a typical heat wave for this time of year. By noon, the air temperature had already risen to 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and the hot red sandstones gave off dry, heavy heat. It was on this day that 18-year-old Samantha Miller, fresh out of high school, decided to make her first independent venture into the wilderness. For a girl who grew up in bustling Las Vegas, this hike was to become a kind of border between childhood and the beginning of a new stage at university. According to her parents, Amelia and Henry, Samantha had been preparing for this trip for 3 weeks. She was a systematic person and prone to introversion, so the idea of spending a few days alone with books and a sketchbook seemed perfect for her. The case file indicates that the girl visited 2 specialized camping stores where she purchased a lightweight 2-person tent, a sleeping bag designed for cool desert nights, and a gas burner. Her parents did not hide their concern. Amelia recalled during the first interrogations that she had repeatedly asked her daughter to take at least one friend with her, but Samantha was adamant about her desire for absolute solitude. As a result of lengthy arguments, a compromise was reached. Samantha promised to send a short message every day at midnight and in the morning as soon as she woke up. On June 11th, at 10 o'clock in the morning, Samantha's silver sedan crossed the entrance to the park. The surveillance cameras at the automatic checkpoint captured the girl. She was wearing her seatbelt with a wide straw Panama hat and a printed map of the Calico Hills sector on the passenger seat. This was the last digital trace of her movement recorded by official devices. The girl had set up camp in an area about 2 miles from the main parking lot. Despite her desire for solitude, June is the peak season, and nearby camping sites were partially occupied. According to testimony from a group of young men from Henderson who were camping 100 yards away, Samantha appeared calm and organized. One of the hikers told investigators that the girl approached them around 9 p.m. According to the witness, she apologized for the disturbance and asked for a lighter. As it turned out, she had left her own at home. The young people helped her light a small fire and even invited her to join them for dinner. However, Samantha politely declined, explaining that she wanted to read a few chapters of the book before it got too dark. At 12 o'clock and 3 minutes, Amelia received a short message on her phone. "Everything is great. I love you. Good night." This signal was the final confirmation that Samantha was safe and within the coverage area of one of the cell towers located on the outskirts of Las Vegas. The worry began the next day. At 9 o'clock in the morning, the promised morning message did not arrive. Henry tried to call his daughter more than 10 times, but Samantha's phone was turned off or out of service. Around 2 in the afternoon, a group of tourists who were lending the girl a lighter. Despite the fact that the sun was already high at the zenith, the girl's tent remained tightly zipped up. Her hiking boots were standing at the entrance in the same position as in the evening. According to one of the young men, they called her name several times, but there was no response. When they felt uneasy, they called the Rangers. The official report from the Clark County Sheriff's Office states that a patrol arrived at 2 o'clock, 45 minutes in the afternoon. Inside the tent, they found all of Samantha's belongings: her wallet with $45 in cash, her driver's license, a sketchbook with an unfinished sandstone sketch, and a phone with a completely dead battery. However, the girl herself was not present. Samantha's backpack was also left in the tent, which ruled out the possibility that she had gone for a long walk. The case was assigned to Detective Jack Miller, a man who had seen hundreds of desert disappearances in his 15 years with the Nevada Police Department. Jack immediately initiated a large-scale operation. 2 helicopters equipped with thermal imaging cameras and more than 50 volunteers were involved in the search. For the first 48 hours, a 5-mile radius of the camp was combed. Dog handlers and search dogs worked on difficult rocky areas and in dry stream beds. However, the results were nil. The dogs picked up the scent only within 10 yards of the tent, after which the scent broke off on rocks. According to Detective Jack, Red Rock is a treacherous place. The huge number of cracks in the sandstone and deep crevices can be a trap, even for an experienced hiker. However, Samantha was careful. She had no water or equipment with her, which indicated that if she had left her tent, it was either a spontaneous decision or she was not going to go far. Weeks and then months passed. Search operations were gradually scaled back due to the lack of new information. Amelia and Henry spent hundreds of hours in the canyon, posting thousands of postcards with their daughter's face on them. Jack Miller recalled that this case was a personal defeat for him. He never found a single clue, no evidence of a struggle or an outside presence. The desert swallowed Samantha Miller without a sound, leaving only an empty tent and thousands of unanswered questions. The case went cold, becoming just another folder on an archive shelf covered in the dust of oblivion. Not a living soul could have imagined that 10 years later, this story would be continued thousands of miles away from the hot sands of Nevada. The calendar on the wall of a small rented apartment in the suburbs of Richmond, British Columbia, showed October 2015. For most residents of this quiet Canadian town, life went on as usual. But for one man, time seemed to have been divided into before and after. 10 years ago, Jack Miller, a former Las Vegas Police Department detective, had been on a well-deserved vacation for 3 years. His move to Canada was motivated by a desire to be closer to his son and help raise his 2 grandchildren. But the real reason for his retirement was much deeper and darker. The case of the disappearance of 18-year-old Samantha Miller in June of 2005 had become for him not just another investigation, but a personal curse. He remembered the tremor in Amelia's voice when she'd called the station every month for the first 5 years to ask if there was any new news. "We're doing everything we can." But he knew it wasn't enough. The feeling of a heavy defeat and an unfulfilled promise to the girl's parents eventually forced him to put the badge on his desk. On that Tuesday, a thick gray fog hung over Richmond, and it had been raining lightly since the morning. Jack, who had never fully adjusted to the Canadian humidity after decades of hot Nevada climate, sought refuge in the local public library. It was his favorite place. The silence, the smell of old paper products, and the rows of shelves created the illusion of order that he so much missed in real life. Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Jack was sitting in the reading room, looking through an article about the history of the development of the Western Territories. It was at this moment that his attention was drawn to a librarian who was putting returned books on the shelves in the fiction section. She was about 15 feet away from him. The woman looked absolutely ordinary. A light beige cardigan, hair pulled back in a modest ponytail, and thin metal-rimmed glasses. At first glance, she could have been about 30 years old, but as she turned in profile to read the title on the spine of the book, Jack felt his professional memory, which had stored thousands of faces over the years, suddenly produced a clear match. The structure of the cheekbones, the line of the jawline, and the subtle dimple. It was the face of the girl he had been looking for in every coroner's report for the past decade. The detective froze, afraid that the slightest movement would dispel this mirage. The distance from Las Vegas to Richmond was more than 1,300 miles. The probability of meeting the missing girl from Nevada in the Canadian suburbs was mathematically negligible. However, his instinct, honed by years of dangerous service, screamed otherwise. Jack stood up and, pretending to look for a particular shelf, began to slowly approach the woman. When there was no more than 6 feet between them, the woman reached for the top shelf to put down a heavy encyclopedia. At that moment, the sleeve of her light blouse rose up several inches, exposing the inside of her left wrist. Jack stopped, his eyes focused on a pale patch of skin. There, against the background of thin veins, was an old white scar in the shape of a perfect crescent. The detective's memory instantly replayed the recording of Amelia Miller's interrogation from June 20, 2005. Samantha's mother then described her daughter's special features, choking back tears. According to Amelia, this scar appeared when Samantha was 12 years old. The girl wanted to surprise her parents with breakfast and accidentally pressed her wrist to the hot edge of a cast-iron skillet. It was a unique mark, a thermal burn that could not be confused with anything else. In the report of the inspection of the Red Rock Canyon disappearance site, this detail was highlighted in bold as a key identifier. Jack looked at this scar and realized that he was looking at more than just a woman who looked like her. It was Samantha Miller, the same 18-year-old high school graduate who had disappeared from the surface of the earth 10 years ago in the hot Nevada desert. Here she stood, in safe Canada, working in a quiet library, looking like someone who had nothing to do with the crime chronicles of the past decade. Her movements were calm, almost mechanical, but there was a tension in the corners of her eyes that Jack had often seen in people who lived in constant expectation of danger. The detective took another step, standing almost close to her. He could smell the faint odor of lavender and paper. The woman noticed his presence and turned her head. For a second, their eyes met. There was no recognition in her eyes, only a polite willingness to help the visitor, behind which was a deep, almost animal fear. According to Jack's later observations, recorded in his personal diary, the woman reacted to his approach as if he were a predator who had accidentally entered her territory. She instantly lowered her sleeve to cover her wrists and took a subtle step back, increasing the distance between them to 3 feet. Her breathing became somewhat rapid, although she tried to maintain her outward calm. Jack realized that any sudden movement or direct question could startle her and she would disappear again, just as she had in June of 2005. He had to act professionally, like a detective, not like a stunned man. Samantha Miller was alive. This was a fact that crossed out all theories of accident or murder in the desert. But why she was here, 1,300 miles from home, under a different name, and in a state of constant anxiety, was a new, much more complex mystery. The case he thought was dead had suddenly taken a breath right in the middle of the quiet library stacks of British Columbia. Over the next 14 days, former detective Jack Miller became an integral part of the library landscape in Richmond. He chose the patient observer tactic he often used during his long surveillance stints in Las Vegas. Jack would arrive at 10 o'clock in the morning, sharp, take the same table in the corner of the reading room, about 20 feet from the front desk, and immerse himself in reading, actually recording every movement of the woman who was known here as Alice. In his later reports to the Canadian police, Jack described Samantha's behavior as a classic example of someone in a state of chronic post-traumatic stress. She was quiet, almost invisible. Even on days when the room temperature rose due to a malfunctioning heating system, Alice never took off her dark gray, long-sleeved cardigan. She moved cautiously, as if afraid of making an unnecessary noise, and always kept her head slightly tilted down. Jack noticed that she never engaged in conversations with her coworkers, limiting herself to short, professional phrases. According to the detective's notes, the first attempt at contact took place on the 3rd week of his observations. Around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, when there were almost no visitors in the library, Jack approached the shelf where Alice was arranging geography books. He chose a moment when she was most focused and, as if by accident, drew her attention to a book about the national parks of the United States. According to Jack's words recorded in the reenactment protocols, he began the conversation by discussing the climate. He mentioned that he had moved from Nevada and described in detail the dry, hot air of Las Vegas that causes skin to crack after 30 minutes in the sun. The woman's reaction was immediate and terrifying in its intensity. Jack saw her pupils dilate and her fingers holding the heavy volume turn white with tension. She was not merely frightened, but had a flash of animal terror. Alice sharply denied any connection with these places, answering with dry, pre-rehearsed phrases. "I've never been there. I don't like the desert. It's dangerous." Her voice trembled, and she immediately hurried off to the back room, leaving the book on the floor. A few days later, however, Jack decided to have another conversation. This time, he was more cautious. When the sleeve of her cardigan accidentally slipped while she was working on a high shelf, exposing the crescent scar again, he asked quietly about it, feigning sincere sympathy. Jack had hoped that this question would trigger at least a faint memory of that morning in Las Vegas when 12-year-old Samantha had tried to surprise her mother with breakfast. Instead, he heard a story that made him shudder to realize the depth of the manipulation. Samantha, looking him straight in the eye with fanatical belief, recounted a legend she had apparently repeated to herself thousands of times over the past 10 years. She claimed that the burn was a memory of her salvation. According to her version, she got it when she dropped her hand on the hot grate of a metal stove in a cabin in the woods while trying to escape a serial killer who was stalking her in Red Rock Canyon. She claimed that it was Oliver, the man she lives with, who found her that night, pulled her from the fire, and treated her wounds at great personal risk. For the experienced detective, this was the moment of truth when Jack realized a terrifying psychological picture. Samantha was not just a prisoner in the classical sense. Her memory had been completely reformatted. The kidnapper didn't just take her freedom, he took her past, replacing real memories with a fictional story of a heroic rescue. The childhood scar that was proof of her life with her parents became in her mind a symbol of loyalty to the man who kidnapped her. She sincerely believed that the entire outside world was inhabited by monsters, and Oliver was her only protector. Jack understood that any direct pressure now, any attempt to prove to her that she was Samantha Miller from Nevada, would lead to disaster. In this state, she could either commit suicide or immediately inform Oliver, which would make them disappear again in an unknown direction. The detective decided to take a step back. He had to act outside the library. He needed to find the answer to the question, who was this Oliver, and how did he manage to create an illusion for an 18-year-old girl that replaced her reality for a whole decade? Jack knew that he was now hunting a man who possessed something much more dangerous than a gun. He was hunting a master of psychological control. The next step was to collect a dossier on the Savior, whose house was located a few miles from the center of the town, hidden behind a high fence and dense trees. On October 23, 2015, former Detective Jack Miller decided to temporarily cease all direct contact with the woman known in Richmond as Alice. His experience suggested that she was on the verge of a psychological breakdown, and any unnecessary attention from a stranger from Nevada could make her run away. Now the investigation had moved into the phase of technical surveillance and collection of circumstantial evidence, a routine job that Jack had done thousands of times during his decades of service in Las Vegas. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, as his shift at the library was coming to an end, Jack took up a position across the street, about 50 yards from the main entrance. According to his notes, he saw an inconspicuous gray sedan pull up to the very edge of the parking lot. The car was covered in a layer of old dirt, and its rear window bore a faded sticker from a local dealership that had closed 5 years earlier. Jack noted that the driver did not get out of the car or even turn off the engine. As soon as Alice got into the passenger seat, the car moved off without waiting for her to fasten her seatbelt. Using his old connections in the police department, Jack was able to confidentially check the vehicle's registration number. The result of the check was a second major clue. The car formerly belonged to a man who had died of a heart attack in Alberta 3 years earlier. The car was not reported stolen, but its documents were effectively dead. This was a classic tactic of people trying to stay off the radar of government services. For the next 3 days, Jack cautiously followed the gray sedan 2 or 3 blocks away. The route was always identical. They were headed to a residential neighborhood on the very outskirts of Richmond, where buildings were sparse and plots of land were larger. The house the couple lived in was at the very end of a dead-end street, 1 mile from the nearest shopping center. In his reports, the detective described the building in detail. It was a 1-story ranch-style house, but it was strikingly different from the neighboring dwellings. Around the perimeter of the property was a wooden fence about 8 feet high, the top of which was equipped with a barely visible, slanted barbed wire mount. The windows of the house, even on bright sunny days, remained tightly curtained with heavy, light-tight fabrics. On each corner of the roof, Jack noticed modern surveillance cameras with a wide viewing angle that clearly did not fit into the budget of an ordinary middle-class family. Sitting in his car 2 blocks away, Jack analyzed the information he had gathered. According to the short phrases Alice had dropped during conversations at the library, her husband Oliver worked remotely in the information technology field. However, the man's lifestyle was more like being in the deep underground. The high fence and cameras were not meant to protect him from thieves. They created an airtight space. Jack understood that it was not just a fortress, but a professionally equipped cage where every exit of Alice to the outside world was strictly regulated and controlled. However, visual resemblance and a suspicious house were not enough to attract Canadian authorities and refer the case to the FBI. They needed irrefutable biological evidence. Jack knew that the Las Vegas archives had DNA samples of Samantha Miller taken from her personal belongings back in 2005. All he had to do was get a current sample from a woman who called herself Alice. The chance came on the 27th of October. Around 11 o'clock in the morning, a short maintenance break was called in the library to check the fire alarm system. The staff went to a small seating area. Jack noticed that Alice had brought a paper cup of coffee with her. She took only a few sips, constantly looking back at the windows overlooking the parking lot where a gray sedan usually waited. When the signal sounded that the inspection was over, she hurriedly left the half-empty cup on the plastic table at the entrance and returned to the hall. Jack acted instantly. Pretending to drop his glasses near the trash can, he bent down, blocking the view from the security camera inside the room. Within 5 seconds, he replaced Alice's glass with an identical empty one he had prepared in advance. Using a sterile plastic bag, he carefully wrapped the object, which had a clear trace of lipstick and epithelial cells on its rim. This small piece of pressed paper became the most valuable piece of evidence Jack had ever seen. He knew that if the lab confirmed the match, the walls of the house behind the high fence would begin to crumble. She was putting the books back in the shelves, unaware that her 10-year stay in the shadow of another man was coming to an end. Jack sent the package by express mail to a private genetic laboratory in Vancouver, paying a $300 rush fee. Now everything depended on the results of the analysis, which were due within the next 48 hours. On October 29, 2015, while the biomaterial samples were in the Vancouver lab, former detective Jack Miller began his own investigation into the identity of the man known as Oliver. He had only one clear photograph at his disposal, taken with a long focus lens from a distance of about 70 yards. The photo showed a man in his 30s with deep-set eyes and a thin lip line, staring intently at the road as he drove out of the library parking lot. Jack couldn't shake the feeling of déjà vu. His professional intuition told him that this face had appeared in his field of vision before, but not in the context of the Samantha Miller case. Using encrypted communication channels with his former colleagues in Las Vegas, Jack gained access to the police department's digital archives for the year 2005. He searched not among the kidnapping suspects, but among all the protocols that contained the name Oliver or similar descriptions of his appearance. after 12 hours of continuous document analysis, the detective came across a report on a traffic accident that occurred in March of 2005, exactly 3 months before Samantha disappeared. According to archival data, a gray car driven by 22-year-old Oliver Watson drove into the oncoming lane at mile 15 of the highway leading to Canyon. The accident killed a passenger, his fiancée, 20-year-old Claire Evans. Oliver survived with 2 broken ribs and a mild concussion. However, eyewitness accounts and paramedic reports recorded in the case painted a frightening picture of the driver's psychological state. One of the officers who arrived at the scene of the accident noted in his report that Oliver refused to let go of the girl's body, repeating the same phrase, "I had to save her." Jack found a photo of the deceased Claire Evans in the database. When he brought it up on the screen next to Samantha Miller's portrait, it was as if the room became colder. The resemblance was not just noticeable, it was striking. The same oval face, identical shade of dark blonde hair, and subtle asymmetry of the eyes. The documentary report of the psychologist who examined Oliver after the accident stated that the man suffered from pathological guilt and showed signs of dissociative disorder. The manslaughter charge was dropped due to a technical malfunction of the car, but Oliver Watson actually disappeared from Las Vegas radar shortly after his bride's funeral. Analyzing these facts, Jack built a reconstruction of the events that led to the Red Rock Canyon tragedy. Oliver, broken by loss, probably met Samantha by chance in the city. In his distorted reality, she became not just a girl, but a second chance, the physical embodiment of Claire, whom he had failed to save on the highway. The investigation now suggested that Oliver had been following Samantha for several weeks, studying her habits and learning about her plans for a solo hike. The documents that Jack later handed over to Canadian law enforcement authorities stated that for Oliver, the kidnapping was not an act of aggression in the classical sense. In his mind, it was a large-scale rescue operation. He did not want to harm the girl. He wanted to protect her from a world that, in his mind, was taking away everything he cared about. The Nevada desert became the perfect place for Samantha Miller to die for everyone and be born as Alice for him alone. Jack realized that Oliver had created an artificial environment for the girl based on fear and false gratitude. The memory of the serial killer in the woods that Samantha recounted in the library was a carefully constructed lie that Oliver used to replace the real events of that night in the canyon. The kidnapper had convinced the 18-year-old that the entire world outside of his control was a deadly danger zone where only maniacs and murderers were waiting for her. Sitting in his apartment thousands of miles away from the crime scene, Jack looked at Oliver's photo. Now he knew who he was dealing with. This was not a random criminal, but a man who believed in his sainthood. Oliver Watson didn't just keep Samantha behind a high fence in Richmond. He kept her in the prison of his own madness, where every mile of distance from her real home was just another layer of protection he built around her. The detective realized that time was running out. The DNA results were due any minute now, and as soon as the paper confirmed Samantha's identity, he would have to face a man who had learned over the past 10 years to perfectly disguise his shadow among ordinary people. On October 30th, 2015, Jack Miller received an encrypted file with the results of a genetic examination on his email. The official laboratory report left no room for doubt. The probability that the woman known as Alice was Samantha Miller was 99%. The DNA sample from the coffee cup matched the data obtained from Samantha's personal belongings in June 2005. But Jack, as an experienced officer, understood that biological identification was only half the battle. The real difficulty was that Samantha, who had spent 10 years under the full control of her kidnapper, was psychologically programmed. As psychological experts later noted in their conclusions, Oliver created an absolutely hermetic world for the girl, where he was the only source of truth. For 10 years, they were constantly on the move. According to the recovered rental data and travel routes, the couple changed more than 7 U.S. states and 3 Canadian provinces. As soon as Samantha began to get used to a new place or show minimal interest in others, Oliver would claim a new threat and force her to pack within 30 minutes. The main tool of Oliver's manipulation was fear Jack later found in the house, a whole collection of fake newspaper clippings that the kidnapper had skillfully produced on professional equipment. These fake articles told of a brutal serial killer whom the press allegedly called the Desert Butcher. Oliver convinced Samantha that this maniac not only killed her parents, Amelia and Henry, in 2000, but was still looking for her to finish the job. According to interrogation reports, Oliver even faked threatening phone calls. He used technical means to change his voice, putting Samantha on the phone for a few seconds so that she would hear hoarse breathing or a promise of reprisal, after which she would beg him for protection in tears. This psychological prison was much stronger than any bars. Samantha lived in a cage she could not see and considered Oliver her only savior. Even working at the Richmond Library was part of his plan. He allowed her to do so only because the small library was an isolated and quiet place where he could easily control her every move. In addition, working with books helped Samantha to stay in a stable emotional state, which made her more compliant with his orders at home. The physical marks on the girl's body played a special role in this control system. Oliver did not just make up a story about the rescue. He integrated Samantha's real scars into it. In addition to the burn on her wrist, which Jack had learned about earlier, the kidnapper used a small scar on her forehead, which he had received in early childhood. In Oliver's version, this mark was the result of a killer punch from which he allegedly shielded her with his body in Red Rock Canyon. Every time Samantha looked in the mirror, she saw not the memory of falling off her bike, but sacred proof of her captor's heroism. According to neighbors who later testified, Alice and Oliver seemed to be a perfect, albeit somewhat reserved couple. No one heard screams or the noise of struggle behind the high fence. It was a quiet tyranny. Oliver became her protector, father, and God in one person. Jack realized that if he simply burst into the house with the police, Samantha would take it as an attack by the butcher and could make a fatal mistake. The detective realized that Samantha Miller was not free even when she was alone in the library reading room. Her mind remained in the tent in the middle of the Nevada desert where Oliver had first injected her with chloroform. 10 years of her life had been replaced by an illusion of security that was in fact the most brutal form of captivity. Now Jack had to figure out a way to destroy that illusion without destroying Samantha herself. He knew that the truth could be sharper than a knife, and he would have to use it with surgical precision. The next step was to remove Samantha from this artificial world, but for that, Jack needed a special object from her past, something that Oliver could not explain with any of his legends. On November 3, 2015, at 6 o'clock in the morning, a quiet street on the outskirts of Richmond was blocked by 4 unmarked cars. The operation to arrest the man, known as Oliver Watson, had been in the works for 48 hours in close cooperation between former Detective Jack Miller, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and FBI officials. According to the task force's protocols, the arrest took place without a shot being fired. Oliver did not resist. When the officers entered the house, he simply raised his hands, maintaining a look of calm, almost religious humility on his face. However, for the woman he had kept in a state of psychological isolation for 10 years, this morning was the beginning of a real apocalypse. The officers' reports show that at the time of Oliver's arrest, Samantha Miller was in a state of acute psychosis. She did not feel relief. On the contrary, she threw herself at the police, trying to shield her kidnapper, and shouted that the butcher finally found them. In her warped mind, the men in uniform were not saviors, but mercenaries of the same fictional killer that Oliver had been terrifying her with for a decade. She had to be taken out of the house in handcuffs, not as a suspect, but for her own safety, as she tried to harm herself to avoid falling into the hands of the monsters. At 8 o'clock, 20 minutes in the morning, Samantha was taken to the police station to a special room for working with victims of violence. According to the notes of the psychologist on duty, over the next 4 hours, the woman refused water, food, and any visual contact. She sat in the corner on the couch, hugging herself with her arms, and rocked back and forth continuously. The only thing she repeated in a quiet, monotone voice was the same phrase: "He saved me. You don't understand. He's the only one who protected me." Any attempt to talk about her parents or Las Vegas triggered a new panic attack. At 12 o'clock in the afternoon, Jack Miller, who had been watching her through the one-way glass all along, decided to act. He realized that standard methods of persuasion would not work here. Samantha's logic was completely replaced by Oliver's. The detective entered the room, asking his colleagues to turn off the sound recording to create the illusion of privacy. He did not bring any evidence folders, DNA printouts, or photos of Oliver in handcuffs. He had only one old, slightly faded photo in a plastic tread that he had received from Amelia Miller by email only an hour before. According to Jack's words recorded in his final report, he sat down on the floor across from Samantha, keeping a distance of about 5 feet. He did not try to touch her. Instead, he talked about her scars. The reconstruction of the conversation indicates that Jack recalled her own words from the library, how Oliver allegedly stitched up her wounds in the woods after being attacked by a killer when she was 18. Samantha looked up at him, her eyes filled with rage. According to Jack's testimony, she exclaimed, "I remember the blood. I remember him holding my hand and telling me I was safe now." It was at this moment that Jack placed a photograph on the floor in front of her. The picture was of a little girl of about 7 years old, sitting on a blue bicycle against the backdrop of a typical house in the suburbs of Las Vegas. The girl was laughing, squinting against the bright Nevada sun. "That's you, Sam," Jack said quietly, his words recorded in the protocol as the decisive moment of the operation. "You're 7 years old here. This picture was taken in July of 1994. You fell off your bicycle in front of your house, and your father, Henry, took you to the hospital, where you received 3 stitches." Samantha froze. For 30 seconds, the room was completely silent. She slowly reached for the photo, her fingers trembling. According to the description of the psychologist watching the monitor, at that moment, 2 incompatible realities collided in her mind. The logic was ruthless. If the scar she thought was proof of her salvation at the age of 18 was already on her face at 7, then Oliver's whole story was a lie. "He took your old wounds and made up new reasons for them," Jack continued, watching her every move. "He didn't save you from a killer, Samantha. He was the very monster you were trying to escape. If he lied about your scar, what else did he lie about?" This was the moment when the decades-long dam of illusion broke. Psychologists call it a collapse of dissociation. Samantha covered her face with her hands, and a sound came from her chest that those present later described as the scariest thing they had ever heard in their lives. It wasn't a cry of pain, it was realization. Along with the truth about the scar, real memories began to come back to her. She remembered not the heroic struggle with the butcher, but the smell of chemicals in the tent in Red Rock Canyon. She remembered the cold metal of the chains on her ankles in the months after her disappearance. She remembered Oliver making her repeat a new name thousands of times until she forgot her own. Samantha fell to the floor, curled up in a ball, and began to cry. For the first time in 10 years, she was crying not for her savior, but for her stolen life. She was no longer Alice from Richmond. She was Samantha Miller again, an 18-year-old girl who just wanted to celebrate her coming of age in the mountains. Jack Miller left the room, leaving her in the care of the doctors. He knew that the hardest part of the journey, returning to reality, was just beginning. But now she had a weapon that Oliver could not destroy: her own memory. On March 14, 2016, the Supreme Court of British Columbia put an end to the legal part of the case, which had lasted more than 10 years. The trial of Oliver Watson did not become a loud sensational event with crowds of journalists at the entrance. As at the insistence of Samantha's lawyers and psychologists, the hearings were held in camera. According to the official court record, Oliver was charged with 5 counts, including kidnapping, unlawful detention, use of false documents, and causing serious psychological harm. According to the bailiffs present at the hearing, Oliver Watson listened to the verdict with a completely indifferent expression on his face, which looked more like a martyr's mask. Even when the judge announced the sentence, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for 25 years. The man did not show any emotion. The only time he looked up was when Samantha appeared in the room to give closed testimony. Eyewitnesses claimed that he looked at her with a condescending smile, as if he was forgiving her for her betrayal and misunderstanding of his heroic deed. Until the very end, Oliver remained a prisoner of his own fictional reality, where he was the only person. For the girl herself, this sentence was just a formality. She had long ceased to be a part of his story, although the path to her own freedom turned out to be much more difficult than expected. Samantha Miller's homecoming was not like a scene from a Hollywood drama. There were no balloons at the plane's gate, loud music, or instant healing through a hug. A report from the Vancouver Medical Center, where she spent the first 4 months after her release, describes the patient's condition as profound disorientation. The real world was too loud, too fast, and too devoid of the rigid order that Oliver had created. Instead of instant happiness, there was the silence of long hospital corridors, thousands of hours of conversations with psychotherapists, and a painful rehabilitation journey where every independent walk to the nearest park was considered a victory. The meeting with her parents took place only 9 days after her epiphany at the police station. The psychologists only gave permission for contact when they were convinced that Samantha would not perceive them as part of the butcher illusion. According to Amelia Miller's memories recorded in her later interview for the documentary archive, this moment was the most painful of their lives. Henry and Amelia had aged in those 10 years as if 3 decades had passed. Their faces were marked by deep wrinkles left by prolonged, frozen grief. For a long time, Samantha couldn't even touch their hands. She sat 5 feet away, carefully studying her parents' every move, as if afraid they would crumble like another of Oliver's inventions. But they were real, warm, alive, and loving. They were physical proof that the world didn't end beyond the high fence in Richmond. 1 year has passed. September of 2016 in Las Vegas was unusually hot. The temperature in the shade reached 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Samantha sat on a wooden bench in the garden of her parents' house, hidden in the shade of old oleanders. From this place, she could not see the cliffs of Red Rock Canyon, but the dry desert air constantly reminded her that she was home. In her hands, she held a small mirror in a silver frame. Samantha slowly held it up to her face and fixed her gaze on the scar on her forehead, the same mark she had made when she fell off her bike when she was 7. For a decade, she had hated the mark because in her mind, it was a mark of Oliver's ownership, a sign that he owned her body and her memory. But now, looking at the reflection, she saw something completely different. This scar no longer belonged to her captor. It had become a symbol of her true self, proof that even after 10 years of complete isolation, Oliver had not been able to erase her childhood. It was the same little girl on the blue bike who survived despite all attempts to break her identity. According to her therapist's notes, it was during this period that Samantha began to talk about the future in the present tense. She ran her finger over the scar, feeling its uneven texture, closed the mirror, and took a deep, calm breath for the first time in years. The air was hot and smelled like dry grass and heated stones, just like it should have smelled at home. The darkness that had occupied her mind for 10 years had finally receded under the bright Nevada sun. Samantha Miller hadn't just come home. She saved herself, managing to remember the truth where lies were the only law. The story that began with a disappearance in the hot desert ended here, in a quiet garden where time finally began to count again.